Okay, I'm going to talk about the Opsahl Commission, which was set up by a group of people in Belfast in 1992 at a time, to use the words of one voluntary organisation that was involved, a time of great fatalism and despair in Northern Ireland. The Northern Ireland conflict lasted for, at that point in 1992, lasted for 24 years, which is 4 times longer than the Second World War and 8 times longer than the Spanish Civil War. And after 24 years of paramilitary violence and political failure, a group of us, of ordinary citizens, decided it was time to ask our fellow citizens for their ideas about how to get Northern Ireland out of the political deadlock it had been in for so long. Remember that Northern Ireland was divided, deeply divided, between those who wanted to stay part of the United Kingdom, who we call Unionists, and those who wanted to be part of a united Ireland, to join with the Republic of Ireland in a united Ireland, who we call nationalist or Republican. And this was all happening against a background of unemployment, poverty, and economic decline. So a small group of people, drawn largely from the community and voluntary sector, and also some academics and some church people, based on an idea put forward by a professor of law at the university in Belfast and the editor of a local independent magazine, to set up an independent commission to ask people about ways forward for Northern Ireland. It then searched for 7 independent commissioners, eminent people from Ireland, Britain, and other countries, who would reflect on the ideas, the submissions that we received from the citizens. We were very privileged to get an eminent Norwegian human rights lawyer, Torkel Opsal, former member of the UN and European Human Rights Commissions, to chair it. And other commissioners came from the United States, from England, and from Ireland, both parts of Ireland. All eminent, fair-minded, independent people with some knowledge, not huge in some cases, of the Northern Ireland situation. 3 professors, 1 former EU official, 1 former church leader, and the widow of a former Prime Minister of Northern Ireland. We also had a very committed management committee of about a dozen people with a range of skills: lawyers, business people, educationalists, journalists, and 4 from the community and voluntary sector, the people who work with grassroots community groups, who were a very significant group of people in those days when politics had effectively failed. Nobody from government, nobody from political parties. It was also a happy accident that there was an excellent personal chemistry between the very different people on the commission, with the tone set by the chair, Torkel Opsal. We had to be clear that we were utterly independent of political parties and the 2 governments, the British and Irish governments. Northern Ireland was a place of great fear and suspicion at the time. And our challenge was to persuade ordinary people to give us their ideas and to put their ideas down in writing, which is a great challenge when you're talking to people of all backgrounds, all social classes, all educational backgrounds. The politicians were very dismissive of us at the beginning. But when the latest round of political negotiations failed in the middle of the Opsahl Commission's work, The work lasted 13 months, from 1992 to, from May 1992 to June 1993. In the middle of that, the latest round of political negotiations failed. And for the last few months, the governments became interested in what we were doing. For example, the Irish Deputy Foreign Minister, the Irish Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign Affairs became a strong supporter. And in Northern Ireland, we were able to persuade the authorities to allow us to ask the prisoners for their ideas, because there were many prisoners from the background of the IRA, who were the organization that was using political violence to try and bring about a united Ireland, and what we call the loyalist paramilitaries, who were the paramilitary groups who were fighting to retain the presence of Northern Ireland as part of the United Kingdom. There were many, many prisoners from those organizations, and some of them gave good submissions to our commission. We did want the political parties to make submissions as well. We didn't want to be accused, as we were, of being a non-elected group who were trying to bypass electoral politics. We saw our role as feeding new ideas into the political process, which was very much in need of them in the early 1990s, with the IRA and loyalist paramilitary violence continuing and the politicians completely deadlocked. The management committee was very representative of Northern Ireland society. One journalist, 3 lawyers, 2 business people, 2 former school principals, 5 people active in the community and voluntary sector. And there was a small secretariat, which I left my job. I was a journalist in the Irish Times in Dublin, but I am from Northern Ireland. I left my job for a period on leave of absence to run the secretariat, which was, it changed, but it was between 3 and 6 people during that 13 months. The most important key to the Opsahl Commission's success, and it was successful, I can give you some evidence of that if you want, by statements by prominent people. The most important ingredient in its success was building trust with ordinary people. As I said, Northern Ireland was, to a certain extent still is, less now, a deeply untrusting and suspicious society. And the work we undertook to get people to give their ideas about ways forward was difficult. We had to work hard to overcome the description very often used of us that we were elitist and self-appointed, which was right. We were. There were many academics. We were middle class. It's a problem many independent inquiries of this kind have. But the more ordinary people, ordinary citizens, particularly working class citizens, we could involve, the more credibility we would have. There were 3 phases in the work of the Opsahl Commission. 1, looking for, canvassing for submissions from the public. 2, the public hearings. And 3, the preparation, writing, and launching of the report. We worked very hard with the media. It helped that I was a journalist and knew the media well. Now it would be completely different. If you were doing it now, it would be social media you would have to focus on. But this was before social media. For the first 8 months, we spent gathering submissions. And the public was indifferent to us at the beginning. It's only really during the second phase, and I should say the media were indifferent to us in the first phase. We tried very hard to get publicity in all sorts of imaginative ways, but for the first 8 months, it didn't really work. It's only with the public hearings which started after 8 months, that we started to interest the local media. And that was partly because I persuaded my own paper, the Irish Times, which is the main serious paper of Ireland, to cover the hearings on a daily basis. We also had very good articles in the Financial Times in London and the Guardian in London. And after that, the local media in Belfast started to take an interest. One of the most important things, perhaps the most important things in building trust, was to have good, what we called outreach workers. That we had 3 very good outreach workers. And they were able to go into difficult working class areas and rural areas, particularly the areas in Belfast that supported the IRA, the areas in Belfast that supported the Loyalist paramilitaries, and in the city of Derry, that is the second city of Northern Ireland. And as a result, we got very good submissions from these mainly working class areas. Even middle class people, highly educated people, admitted they found it difficult to sit down and write submissions and send them to us. So how much more difficult was it for working class people, for poorer people? So we had various mechanisms we used. We borrowed tape recorders from the BBC and went with the help of local community leaders to record people who, with the help of the community leaders. And then we used a mechanism which was not well known in those days. It's better known now, called focus groups, now used quite a lot by politicians and marketing people, where using trusted local intermediaries, community leaders and priests, for example, we gathered small groups of people and we facilitated using skilled facilitators and recorded discussions about possible ideas for the future, which were transcribed and seen in confidence by the 7 members of the commission. This was a good way of reaching ordinary people who would never do written submissions and get them to talk about their hopes and fears and ideas. 4 of the 6 focus groups, for example, were in rural areas. One was in a very, very difficult area near the border where people were deeply suspicious. But in the end, they spoke. Talking about the importance of outreach workers, 3 of our outreach workers were women. And we found that was a key element in our success. Women, we found that ordinary people trusted the women outreach workers more, particularly the women in those areas, particularly the working class areas. And because they knew the women and trusted the women anyway, our 3 women outreach workers, some of the best submissions we got were particularly from women, but not only women in those areas. In fact, one submission by a group of women in a very conflicted area of North Belfast led a year later to that group of women receiving a very prestigious Peace Prize by the Stockholm Peace Institute. Then we moved on after 8 months to the public hearings, and we had 19 public hearings. In the first phase, when we were gathering submissions, we held 29 public meetings around Northern Ireland. This was obviously before the internet, before social media. So we held 29 public meetings to spread the word about what we were doing. Then when we got the submissions, we received 550 submissions altogether, which, since some of them were from groups, represented the ideas of 3,000 people in a society of 1.5 million people. Very representative, broad sample of opinion, of people, the citizens' opinion. And we found that at the end, this was in January 1993, after 8 months, we were getting a lot of submissions, just at the end. And we had to stop because we only had enough money. I should say that we raised money. Sorry, just for a moment to go back. We raised the money for this, £228,000 sterling, which would be roughly 500,000 euro now, today. We raised it completely from independent charitable foundations in Britain and in America. But we had, obviously, we only had a certain amount of money. So we calculated we had a year or a little bit more than a year to do this. So after 8 months of collecting submissions from the people, from the public, we had to move to the second phase of public hearings. And at that time, in January 1993, suddenly, the media was interested, the politicians were interested, and most important, the public were interested. And we were getting a lot of submissions. I believe that if we had gone on for another 6 months collecting submissions, we would have got double the number, but we couldn't do that. Shortage of time was one of the main problems of this exercise. So in January 1993, we moved to the phase of public hearings, in which the 7 commissioners travelled around Northern Ireland and held public hearings, and we invited, and it was my small secretariat, and I suppose I played a big part in this, who selected from the 550 submissions, we could have 200 presentations to oral hearings. No, 200 people could present to the public hearings. So we chose 200 of the 550, the ones with the best ideas, and we tried to make them as balanced as possible across the whole of society. Then the seven commissioners listened to the people who'd given the 200 people who'd given those submissions, questioned them in public. They were public hearings. They were very well attended. I think it was that some of them were in the same place. There were 11 places. There were 19 hearings, I think, in 11 or 12 places around Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland is a very small place, remember. I don't know what, Catalonia, I think, has 7.5 million people. It's probably, in Northern Ireland, it's probably 4 times as big as Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland is very small. So the people who spoke to the public hearings ranged from very prestigious people, such as politicians. We had, for example, the most senior, recently retired heads of the administration. That's the most senior bureaucrats in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Very, very important people, not political people. In Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, these are administrative people, but the most powerful administrators recently retired in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, an archbishop, political leaders, but also taxi drivers, school children, trade unionists, women from the working class areas, community activists, ordinary people. And some of the best submissions were from ordinary people. One of the most powerful was from a taxi driver whose son had been killed in what we call a sectarian assassination. He was a Catholic, he was a nationalist, his son had been killed by a loyalist, unionist group, Protestant group. And he gave a very powerful presentation about good policing and bad policing. I should say that we had a completely open agenda. We said to people in the terms of reference, give us submissions, give us ideas about anything that you think is important for the future of Northern Ireland. So it wasn't just politics. We had economics, culture, religion, education, culture, anything that anybody thought was important. So the terms of reference were as broad as they could be. All that we asked for were ideas about the future of Northern Ireland. The public hearings went on for about 7 weeks, 6, 7 weeks. And then in March, we moved to the third stage, which mainly was me preparing, writing, editing the report, which was, I've never worked harder in my life before or since. A citizen's inquiry, the Opsal report on Northern Ireland, which was published as a paperback book, and was a surprise bestseller. So I spent the spring of 1993 preparing the report, a 500-page book, as it turned out. When we launched the book or the report in early June 1993, we gave a copy to everybody who had made a submission. And that had a multiplier effect, because immediately when we launched the book, there were long queues of people in the street outside to get the book. And that was a multiplier effect. The bookshop sold out, obviously people. And the other thing we did, I should say, is very important. Everybody who made a submission, although not all their submissions could be in the book, but everybody's name is in the book. So there is an ownership. This is a report owned by 3,000 people. And in the recommendations, or the report is organized so that the first part of the report is the conclusions of the 7 commissioners and the recommendations of the 7 commissioners. And they made 25 recommendations. And the second part of the book is the submissions or summaries of the submissions of the 3,000 people who made them. So everybody is in the book. And then we also produced a leaflet called 100 Ideas about Ways Forward for Northern Ireland and its People, which was 25 ideas from the recommendations from the commissioners and 75 ideas from the people who gave submissions. Okay, I'm going to just speak for maybe 5 or 10 more minutes, and I'm going to do 2 things. I'm going to talk about first I'm going to talk about the problems, and then just a couple of things that came out of the report and why they were important. Okay, we didn't reach some of the hardest to reach people. We worked hard. Some of the extreme unionists, extreme Republicans, very frightened people who lived in the border areas didn't trust us enough. This unknown group of some foreigners, some academics, middle-class people. So we didn't get everybody we could have got in the more fearful areas. There was not enough time, as I said. The whole exercise lasted 13 months, and we were always running. We were always racing to get to the next stage. I would have loved to employ the outreach workers who were superb for longer, but we only had a certain amount of money. The 3 best outreach workers worked for 7 months, 4 months, and 1 month each. Those were the main problems. I unfortunately had written a book about 6 years previously about one of the unionist politicians, the Reverend Ian Paisley, an extreme unionist, and that meant it was a very critical book that party had nothing to do with us. That was unfortunate. Okay, if I can find it, a number of proposals came out of the report, and quite a few of them ended up in the peace agreement 5 years later, the Good Friday Agreement, which was the miraculous peace agreement and political agreement that ended at that point 30 years of political violence, political conflict in Northern Ireland. And quite a few of our ideas ended up in that. Now, the main idea that ended up was our idea for what we call parity of esteem between unionists and nationalists. So everything in Northern Ireland would be based on equality. Up to then, unionists had been in charge and had discriminated and had run a very discriminatory and oppressive system in which nationalists, Catholics were second-class citizens. We said there must be equality in everything, and that equality, which we call parity of esteem, should be legislated for. It should be in law. That was the first thing. And the second thing we said was that Sinn Féin, who were the party of the IRA, should be included in any negotiations. Up to then, Sinn Féin were not included in anything because they supported the violence of the IRA. You probably have a parallel in the Basque Country. But we said they must be included. There will not be a solution, or we didn't like the word solution. There cannot be any agreement, any settlement in Northern Ireland until Sinn Féin are involved. There were a number of other things which I can't, oh, here we go. Here we go. So those are the two main things that came out of our Opsahl Commission. Other key recommendations were that the IRA and the British Armed Forces, security forces, should begin to make exploratory unilateral moves towards reducing violence. Now, we discovered during the commission, there was a submission from one group in Derry that said this was starting to happen in a small way. This was not known. Now, I should say that all the submissions were public, and they were lodged in a public library at the end of the process, except for 20 confidential submissions. And one of these confidential submissions was this submission about reducing violence by unilateral moves by the two sides. The other thing, we proposed a Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland, which hasn't happened. We propose much greater economic cooperation with the Republic, which has happened, and we urged more women in politics, which we felt was very important. And if you look at now, the two leaders of Northern Ireland are both women. So I'm going to leave it there. I think there were some other questions. I've answered some of them, I hope, but I can answer them. If you have specific questions, I can answer them now.
Thank you very much, Andy. That was really very, very interesting. I hope it has been very interesting also for the rest of the people. Si us sembla ara, jo tinc alguns comentaris, però entenc que probablement vosaltres també teniu alguna idea o algun comentari a fer o alguna pregunta de les quals s'havien adreçat a ell, que a mi em sembla que, mira, alguna a mi em consta que no ha respost potser prou acuradament. Si demaneu pel xat paraula, us vaig donant paraules i aneu intervenint. Si no, ja dic que
you can, in the chat box, you could ask in Spanish.
A la xat podeu formular les preguntes en castellà, si voleu, perquè jo ho entendré.
Pablo.
Dime, María Ángeles.
A veure, jo vull preguntar si en el seu cas hi havia realment...
Was there truly, I mean, people who participate in the whole process?
Estaven involucrats d'alguna manera amb l'acord de pau. Vale? Si és important que les mateixes persones tinguin de la comissió, si nosaltres féssim alguna cosa semblant, vale? Si la mateixa gent de la comissió és important que també estiguin inclosos en el segon procés, no? A la quarta part, diguéssim. No sé si s'entén la pregunta.
Crec que sí.
T'he entès molt bé, Maria Àngels. A veure, 2 punts.
Group of non-politicians, and some of them were foreigners. So they felt their work was a kind of preliminary work. Eventually, the politicians would have to become involved. And eventually, the people involved in political violence would have to become involved. So this was an exploratory exercise. This was, in many ways, one of the elements at the beginning of our peace process. Our peace process lasted from roughly 1993, which was the second year of the Opsahl Commission, to 1998, when the Good Friday Agreement was signed. Well, it went on much longer, but that was the key period during which the violence ended. So we always understood that the politicians would have to come to the peace agreement. That was not our job. But I think in a small way, by bringing forward the views and ideas of ordinary people in the communities, we started a new element in the peace process. And the best example I can give you was the involvement of women. Because one of the key players in the Good Friday Agreement was a women's political party called the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition. Northern Ireland is a very conservative place. Some might say reactionary. And women have never played a significant part in politics before. But some of the women who led the Women's Coalition were either involved in the Opsahl Commission or made important submissions to the Opsahl Commission. And the Opsahl Commission was very impressed by the role of women in peacemaking and peace building and overcoming the barriers in Northern Ireland. So that is an example of the work. I don't want to overstate the role of the Opsahl Commission. The important work that led to peace in Northern Ireland was done by the politicians, the governments, and those who gave up political violence. But in a small way, by involving people, by involving ordinary people who at that point felt helpless and uninvolved. I think one of the statements of the reviews of the newspaper review said, the Opsal report gave platform to voices excluded elsewhere, all tired of the old polemic. It gave hope that in Northern Ireland too, an end is stirring. And that end, the beginning of that end, literally started 6 months after the Opsahl Commission reported and was already happening when we were doing our work. So it was a small element feeding in to the beginning of a peace process that after 25 years, people were weary of conflict and weary of war, weary of violence. And this group of people called the Opsahl Commission came along and said, let's discuss some new ideas. Now, it was a small element, but it was an element that I think helps the politicians even a little bit. And politicians have told us that. It helped them on the road, the beginning of the road, the difficult road to peace in Northern Ireland.
Christian?
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you so much. My name is Christian. I'm the director of the Catalan Institute of Peace. My question was related to what you just mentioned now on timing. It seems from what you just described, the Commission intervened at the perfect timing when politics was not going anywhere. And then a few months after you submitted your report, formal peace negotiations resumed, and then eventually 5 years later led to the Good Friday Agreement. You can never time the right thing. So I wonder, well, I guess in this case, well, I guess the question is, what do you think would have happened if the Opsahl Commission would have done its job earlier? Or even if it had started, would there have been a space for it even in parallel to formal negotiations?
No, I think the timing was perfect. As I said, it was a time where politics had collapsed once again. But in the background, we know now that there were beginning of talks involving the IRA, involving the British government, involving the Irish government, involving what we call constitutional nationalists. That's the people the nationalists who didn't believe in violence. That was starting to happen around the same time. So the timing was perfect. The other part of your question is rather speculative. What happened was that the politicians and the civil servants started to take over shortly after we reported. The politicians and the officials. I mean, I'll just quote one thing from the Irish Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, Dick Spring at the time. And he said, one of the great merits of the Commission is to illustrate how beneath the apparently frozen lines of political division, there is a serious and mature process of reflection on the problem taking place in Northern Ireland, an extraordinary experiment in public participation. I think that word freezing is good. Things were starting on the point of starting to unfreeze through war weariness, through near despair. People were saying, there must be a better way. We've been trying the old ways for 24 years. There must be a better way. And I don't know if John can translate serendipity, but out of this came an idea by a journalist and a law professor. And out of this idea came this commission. And because of the moment that was there, we were able to start in a tiny way to start bringing up some ideas. I don't think it would have worked if it had happened 5 years earlier. I don't think it would have worked. I'm not sure what its role would have been as a parallel exercise once the politicians and civil servants were involved. I mean, for example, in 1995, 1996, so a couple of years later, the Irish government set up a similar thing in Dublin, where it was mainly to try and get Sinn Féin feeding their ideas in, the IRA feeding their ideas in. And that was appealing to the same kind of, well, more political parties, churches, business, voluntary groups, not really the ordinary people. So we really concentrated on the ordinary people, the ordinary citizens. You know, we want to hear your ideas. And I suppose that was our value, that we went out to ask the ordinary people for their ideas. And out of that, we trusted the ordinary people. It was an exercise in democracy. I mean, Torkel Opsal said in his chapter in the book, his introductory chapter, he said that this was an unprecedented, forward-looking experiment in public participation in political debate in a region that is usually characterized as politically rigid, undemocratic, and backward. So it was, I mean, it was a remarkable experiment, which I think its timing was good.
Sí, yo quisiera preguntarle.
I'd like to ask you, Andy, with the benefit of hindsight,
hubiera cambiado del trabajo de la comisión. Actualizándolo, ¿qué cosas son importantes ahora y no lo eran entonces o al revés? ¿Qué cosas funcionaron peor y cambiaría ahora? Gracias.
Oh, thank you.
Well, I've touched on this already a
Home,
little
això ja
bit.
ho he esmentat lleugerament, Xavier?
We failed to reach
Nosaltres vàrem
the
fracassar
extreme
a l'hora
unionists,
d'assolir els extrems, a l'hora d'arribar als extrems,
who are now in government.
que actualment estan en el govern, per cert.
I think the problem was me at that point.
El problema va ser jo, vaig ser jo personalment, em sembla, en aquell
Because
moment.
I was seen as against that, oppositional to that particular party. Getting the extreme unionists involved in exercises of this kind
Sorry, John, I'm not sure you're using
is always difficult.
Sempre és un
translation.
problema.
Oh, sorry.
Sempre els extremistes
People even. They always think anything like this is a conspiracy to move them towards a united Ireland. So I think if I was doing it again, I mean, this is now 27 years later, but you know, if I was doing it again in 1992, 93, I would have had an outreach worker specifically from that section of the population. We did have an outreach worker from the working class. These are subtle differences now, the working class unionist population, but that was a bit different. The second thing was we just could have done with more time. The whole thing was very rushed and we missed people. And the third thing is I would have liked to organize more focus groups, again, to bring more people from those hard to reach, those difficult to reach groups, particularly the extreme Republicans, that's the followers of the IRA, the extreme loyalists, that's the followers of the Protestant, the loyalist paramilitary organizations, and the, as I've said, the Democratic Unionist Party, the extreme Unionist Party, and very much people in the border regions who are very frightened, who are very fearful people. So those would be the three things I would have done differently. And I would have wanted to have, I think, all women outreach workers and all working longer. That's what I would have liked.
Thank you very much.
Jordi Palau, ara.
Jordi Palau has the floor.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Andy. Maybe two very concrete questions. I assume that you said that you were focusing on New Northern Ireland, so in the future of this contribution. What in what terms, if it happened, in these public audiences or focus groups that were sharing about these future visions, the past came through and how it was addressed, especially from victims and families that have suffered from the violent conflict. And the second question is, all these new ideas, new visions for a new society in the future. You said that somehow this had an influence and impact in the peace agreement. But with the perspective now, what do you think would be the impact in the social fabric? The people, not only the people that participated in the process, the more than 3,000 people, but also all the surrounding people of the social fabric of the different origins and participants in that, and how this had, if it had some impact on the social fabric. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The past is everywhere in Northern Ireland. As Irish people, we are obsessed with the past. I don't know what it's like in Spain or in Catalonia, but we are obsessed with the past. We talk always about the past. And in Northern Ireland, much, much more, because when 3,600 people have been killed in political violence in a society of 1.5 million and over 20,000 wounded, 40,000 violent incidents in 30 years, everybody has been touched by the violence. Northern Ireland is an unresolved problem. 100 years ago, the British divided Ireland to resolve a conflict was then running, a war of independence. And we ended up with an independent state in the south of, or most of the island, and a British province in the northeastern part of the island. So, and because that led to a one-party state in Northern Ireland, a one-party unionist state, which then discriminated and against and oppressed its Catholic nationalist minority, the problem festered. The problem was not resolved. And 50 years later, it exploded again. So Northern Ireland, somebody once said, is the most written about, most analyzed small region in the world. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of books. Because it is in democratic Europe, it is for many years, apart from the Basque Country, they were the two areas in democratic Western Europe where there was continuing political conflict over national self-determination issues. There was huge interest in it, much less now, but still then in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. So there was huge analysis of the past. And in Ireland, historians are important people. They're in the newspapers all the time. They're on public platforms. Historians are active participants in public debate, unlike, for example, in Britain. So this was a future-oriented exercise. And of course, when people spoke to us and when people made submissions to us, it was full of stuff about the past. But in the introductory terms of reference we sent out to people, we said, we want you to concentrate on the future. And we want you to think about issues that are resolvable. So, for example, some of the themes that came out of the report, like encouraging more community participation, the European dimension to get over the problem of clashing nationalisms, the EU dimension, that both Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland were in the European Union, not anymore, unfortunately. So, as Torkel said, this was an unprecedented, Torkel Opsal said, an unprecedented forward-looking experience. We appeal to people to try and think about the future. And it was difficult. And we failed a lot of the time. But the fact that, you know, 500 pages of ideas about the future came out of it. And 5 years later, after this report and after this exercise, we had a future-looking, an extraordinarily complex, and some might say visionary, future version of Northern Ireland that brought peace, or largely brought peace, because we still have peace. Well, the problems are still, we still have many problems, but people aren't being killed in political violence in Northern Ireland now. So you could say that between 2,000 and 3,000 people are alive now that would have been dead if the conflict had carried on. And in a small way, we played a part. And that moves on to the your second part of your question, which is the impact. Now, it's difficult for me to measure the impact, the wider social impact. I don't live in Northern Ireland anymore. I live in Dublin now. This is 27 years ago. But I mean, the first impact must be that we have peace. Now, we have deep divisions still in housing, in education, in social life. The divisions are, many people believe, as deep as ever between, on the one hand, the Catholics and the nationalists, on the other hand, the Protestants and the Unionists. But people still say to me, even last week, I was in a discussion not associated with this at all, and a Belfast community worker, a person who I respect greatly, said, maybe we could have another Opsahl Commission. And I know from talking to particularly people who are on the ground, who work with the divided communities in Northern Ireland, still very divided, that every so often one of them says, we could have another Opsahl Commission. So it was seen as an exercise that got out of the straitjacket of nationalists, unionists, Catholics, Protestants, Irish, British, which is the trap, the historical trap of Northern Ireland. And it got out of that and got beyond that and made people talk about other things and had an impact, for example, in bringing to a greater public visibility ordinary, hardworking people in the community who were keeping the cement of society together. We never had a Bosnian-style civil war in Northern Ireland. We were very close sometimes, but we never did. And I believe that those ordinary people, many of them women, working in the community to hold things together, to bring people together in very difficult circumstances, was one of the main factors that we didn't have an outright civil war. And one of the values of the Opsahl Commission is we brought some of these people to public notice. I gave the example of the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition. Again, I don't want to overstate it. It was a small contribution, but there are people in Northern Ireland now who remember the impact that the Opsahl Commission had on their lives, and they remember that it brought them into public view in a way that had never happened before.
Noé.
Thank you, Andy.
My question is a very specific and pragmatic one. At the beginning of the project, people participating in the project knew what the final goal was and what use their testimonials, what would be the use of their testimonials or their contribution. In other projects, there is a resistance. People are fearful that their testimonial.
Entiendo que en este caso, al ser una comisión políticamente independiente, esto se corrigió un poquito más, pero tenía la duda de si detectaron reticencias y miedos de ser utilizados e instrumentalizados políticamente, y si todo era anónimo y si en algún momento se dio un consentimiento informado del uso que se haría de los testimonios. Y la segunda parte de la pregunta ha sido, bueno, era muy parecida a la de Jordi y creo que ya la ha respondido, pero por si acaso hay algún matiz, era si había constancia de que en los lugares donde se había hecho la comisión, había participado, a largo plazo se había dado como un empoderamiento ciudadano, que ahora lo nombrabas con las mujeres, pero incluso en la consolidación del proceso de paz por el empoderamiento y el resurgimiento de esas voces que a veces no estaban silenciadas anteriormente. Vaya. Gracias, Andy.
Okay, thank you.
Gracias. A veure, entenc perfectament bé les teves dues preguntes, Noé. Mira, nosaltres vàrem tenir molts problemes comprensibles, en el que jo anomenaria les zones republicanes, és a dir, les zones nacionalistes de classe treballadora.
Because at that point, the British government had a policy of political vetting. That's what it was called. And that meant that any community group that was looking for government money was vetted to make sure they had no connections with Sinn Féin or the IRA. And if they had connections, and Sinn Féin was still not as strong as it is today, but in those areas was strong, if they had connections, they would not get any money. And that had happened shortly before we appeared with our commission. So people were very suspicious. I remember a very difficult meeting in West Belfast in a very pro-IRA area where we explained what we were doing, but the people were very hostile. And I said, we won't get many submissions from that area, but we did. Again, I come down to the question of trust. People in a fearful, suspicious, mistrusting society will not give you their ideas. As you say, what will you do with our ideas? Will you give our ideas to the government? Will you give our ideas to the authorities? So it was kind of surprising that in the end, we did get, not maybe as many as we would have wanted, but we did get significant submissions from those areas. And for example, Sinn Féin made a submission, and various groups that were close to Sinn Féin made submissions. And in the hearings, in the public hearings, there were some very lively, provocative exchanges between some of those people and some of the commissioners. One of the commissioners had a very strong unionist background. She was the widow of a former unionist prime minister. But those were conversations that needed to happen. But we always assured people, and this is again, I must come back to women again. When I was doing the report, we had very little time, and we had to get, I don't know, several hundred submissions summarized. I don't know, what do I say, over 200 submissions summarized in the report. And I had very little time. But the women outreach workers said to me, every summary that you make has to go back to the person for them to approve it. So in that way, we built up trust. We built up trust that we didn't have any agenda, and that anything that went into our journal, into our report, into our book would be seen and approved by the people who wrote it. Obviously, necessarily, in some cases, a very heavily edited version of what they'd written or said. So I think we managed somehow, probably because of the credibility of the people working in the small secretariat, to win some trust and get people to give us their ideas. The second part of your question was the long-term impact on the citizens. Well, I don't know. It's a difficult one to answer. I think I've probably answered it already to the extent that I can. You know, it was one smallish exercise, you know, employing half a dozen people 27 years ago. My only way of thinking, I'm going to repeat myself and say the same things again, is that it did bring forward particularly some women's groups who have played a significant role since. And when I go to Belfast and Derry now, people tell me it had a great impact at the time in giving people voices. I don't know if it had any long-term impact. And what I said earlier, people, when people get come up against an obstacle now, and there are many obstacles and many barriers still, sometimes they say, let's have another Opsahl Commission.
Thank you very much, Andy. We'll change now a little bit because we're still having 5 persons that want to ask you questions.
Okay.
And 15 minutes left.
Okay.
So if you don't mind,
I'd be short.
Or what we can do is to have these 5 persons.
Perquè em sembla que està pel canal anglès, no?
Pablo, no et sentim.
Vale, perdón.
Maybe I could take two questions and then 3 questions. What about that?
Per què no responga 2 o 3 preguntes ara?
Perdona, Andy, que he cambiado y así me entienden porque no me oían los demás. Tendremos ahora 3 persones que fan preguntes, les feu seguides, ell pren nota, intenta agrupar una mica i després 2 més. Per tant, ara Maria Àngels, Aitziber y Toni, y luego Xavier Badía y Josep María. Si os parece, hacemos las preguntas seguidas, todavía él nos responde, intenta agrupar y así este cuarto de hora final lo aprovechamos al máximo posible. A ver si puede ser.
Yeah.
María Ángeles, empiezas tú y por lo tanto, por favor, a todos brevedad. Gracias.
Gracias. Hi, Andy. No, en español mejor, ¿no? La pregunta es, ¿qué harías diferente?
My question is, okay, what?
Sí, nos has dicho más focus groups, trabajar con mujeres. Si hay algo más, pero sobre todo, ¿tienes una idea de cómo sería esta comisión que te piden que hagas ahora? ¿Vale? Es como para que nos orientes que cómo lo haríamos nosotros, ¿no? Pero, ¿qué harías, cómo sería vuestra comisión ahora, ¿no? Y ya, creo que ya está. Gracias. Gracias.
Perfecto, muy breve. Y ahora Ciber.
Perdona, Pablo, juntamos las preguntas, ¿verdad?
Sí, perdona.
Vale.
Juntamos las preguntas y así aprovechamos al máximo.
Perfecto.
Gracias.
Sí, thank you very much, Andy.
Gracias, Andy.
Yo solamente, igual también para completar con lo de María Ángeles, has dicho que las preguntas que se hicieron eran un poco qué se podría hacer, ¿no? para construir el futuro. Entiendo también en un contexto de violencia política en el que teníais que caminar a un escenario de no violencia para poder tener unas condiciones mejores para poder abordar otros temas, ¿no? Que en ese momento no eran prioritarios. Pero entiendo también que de todas las aportaciones que se recibieron, se construiría también de alguna manera como una agenda de cuáles eran los temas importantes a abordar en un contexto de no violencia en el cual se dieran otras condiciones, quizá más en un contexto de posviolencia y más de reconstrucción o de convivencia, ¿no? Y entiendo un poco que, bueno, no sé, supongo que además de hacer otra comisión, quizá también habrá mucho que rescatar de aquellas aportaciones, ¿no? Como una agenda, y no sé si también ha sido válida o utilizada en los años siguientes a los acuerdos de paz, ¿no? Con todos los trabajos de convivencia y reconciliación que se han hecho en Irlanda del Norte. Muchísimas gracias.
Gracias, Aitziber. Y ahora Toni, si fas la teva pregunta, també la incorporaré.
Sí. A ver, por lo que has explicado, entiendo que vuestro trabajo empujó al mundo político a progresar hasta llegar al acuerdo, ¿no? Y esto creo que es un logro importante vuestro, ¿no? Pero mi pregunta, yo creo que la has respondido en parte en tus intervenciones anteriores, pero sería, una vez se llega al acuerdo político, ¿cómo evoluciona la población? Es decir, ¿el acuerdo político ayuda a la reconciliación, a la aproximación entre las dos fracciones? ¿Se ha producido una reconciliación o una aproximación? ¿Cómo describirías la situación actual, ¿no? La situación política esta es estable, es frágil. Bueno, ¿no? Lo que puedes decir sobre eso, ¿no? Porque a veces el acuerdo político, bueno, ha conseguido una cosa importantísima, que es el cese de la violencia, pero ha conseguido cerrar las cicatrices y aproximar, crear una comunidad más unificada. Gracias.
Gracias, Tony. So now it's your turn, Andy.
Okay.
Molt bé. Perfecte.
I haven't really thought very much. Nobody has asked me about setting up another Opsahl Commission now, although they've suggested it in a passing way. What would I do if I was setting it up now? I'd have to ponder on that. I just answer the second two, and then maybe I'll come back to the first one. Maybe the two will link in. I think the two words are coexistence and reconciliation. We have learned in Northern Ireland to coexist uneasily. A lot of mutual suspicion, but we haven't learned reconciliation yet. The two blocks, the two political and popular blocks, that is the Catholic nationalist Republican bloc that wants a united Ireland and the Protestant unionist bloc that wants to stay part of Britain, the United Kingdom, are probably as far apart as ever. There is there is very little political violence anymore. That is the main gain of the Good Friday Agreement. We now have almost no political violence, and we have a sort of a fragile coalition of ancient enemies who are in government together in Northern Ireland. The party of the IRA, Sinn Féin, and the party of the extreme unionists. It breaks down regularly, but at the moment it is there. On the ground, my impression is that there isn't a lot of reconciliation. There are good people, as there always were, working away. It's easier because there's no violence. But for example, we have things called peace walls now, which are walls between nationalist and unionist, Catholic and Protestant working class areas, non-middle class areas, working class areas. By one count, there are 80 of them. When the Good Friday Agreement was signed, there were maybe 20 or 30. So it is still a deeply divided society. It hasn't become reconciled. The problems are still there. The difference is that because of demographic factors, the fact that the Catholic birth rate is higher than the Protestant birth rate, and many young Protestants go to England and Scotland and don't come back, is that the Catholic population is growing faster than the Protestant population. And over a period of time, we may be in a situation where there will be a majority vote for United Ireland, which is something that's built into the Good Friday Agreement. I believe personally that that would lead to a resumption of the political violence, because then the Protestant unionist population, which is a very martial population, they have a background of being in the British Army. I think that they would then fight to prevent that happening. But that's not for the immediate future. That may happen sometime in the future. I'm quite a pessimist about that. I think we have to be very, very careful if we move towards a united Ireland. But those are the main changes. The absence of violence, the very fragile coalition governing Northern Ireland, and the slow movement, probably demographically, towards an eventual united Ireland, which makes the unionists very fearful. The agenda for non-violence coexistence that came out of the Opsahl Commission, which wasn't only our agenda, we articulated it in particular ways. it's still there. And it was the background to the negotiations that led to the Good Friday Agreement. You know, coexistence, the end of political violence, coexistence leading to reconciliation, both politically and societally, and built into the Good Friday Agreement, the possibility of one day a united Ireland. Those are the three main elements. So I just go back to the first difficult question. I think if you had an Opsahl Commission now, it would be better if it was in the whole of Ireland. But it would have to be two different ones in parallel. Because if you ran an Opsahl Commission from Dublin, where I am now, and many people have said the Irish government should, we have a system in the Republic of citizens' assemblies. It's a very good system by which, if there's a controversial issue, for example, we had abortion a few years ago, before the politicians look at it, or before it goes to the people in a referendum to change the constitution, we have a citizens' assembly, which is 100 randomly chosen people who spend about 6 weekends discussing it. So about 10, 12 days discussing this difficult issue. Now, what some people, including Sinn Féin, have said is we should have something like that to discuss Irish unity, eventual Irish unity. I don't agree with that, because I think that would be set up by the Irish government, and therefore the unionists in Northern Ireland would not come to it. They would not want to speak at it. I think you need two totally independent commissions, one in the north, which the unionists might contribute to, and one in the south in the Republic to find out the views of people here. That would be my main proposal if people were asking. I think the methodology of the Opsahl Commission was a good one. It worked to have an independent commission, no agenda, no closed terms of reference. You have people can talk about anything that is about the future of Ireland. That is the way I think we should do it.
Ara Xavier Badia i Josep Maria, i si em dóna temps a mi per intentar acabar molt ràpidament.
Okay, Xavier and Giuseppe. Thank you, Andy. I have a very specific question.
Les aportacions es centraven sobretot en les visions de futur, intentant pensar coses que ens siguin útils aquí a Catalunya. Volia preguntar si també hi havia elements sobre el diagnòstic sobre la situació, sobre el propi conflicte, perquè jo penso que aquest aquí és un aspecte sobre el que hi ha molta divergència, segons el posicionament previ de cada persona, i sobre si també es preguntava sobre, o hi havia aportacions sobre els sentiments, sobre les vivències de les diferents persones sobre el conflicte. Ho dic, i faig un petit comentari molt breu perquè se m'entengui i que volia que se m'entengués bé. Aquí a Catalunya el conflicte no és violent, és pacífic. Això és un element distintiu i és un gran avantatge, però alhora hi ha el perill que això faci que es menystingui per cada una de les diferents parts els sentiments que poden tenir els diferents membres. No sé si m'explico.
Josep Maria.
Sí. Thank you for your intervention, Andy, and for the work on the Commission. My question has similar elements to the one posed by Noé before. In a small society, everyone knows each other. This has positive things and negative things. I suppose that there were public interventions and private interventions. What mechanism did you put in place to work on the fear of participating? How were the reactions of public opinion to public interventions managed from the Commission? Was the Opsahl Commission unafraid to become a loudspeaker?
Va actuar com a altaveu? Continua, si us plau.
Vale, perdona.
Per què no ho dius en espanyol, millor?
Sí, bueno, era una última pregunta vinculada en això. Si la Comissió Opsal no tenia por a convertir-se en un altaveu per als sectors més republicans o si va donar visibilitat a posicions, diguéssim, intermitges que buscaven punts de consens entre els extrems.
Vale, yo aprovecho también muy rápido una cosa que a lo mejor se ha comentado, pero yo por lo menos no he escuchado. Si había algún tipo de limitación, es una pregunta que venía creo que de Cecil, limitación en las public hearings, las audiencias públicas, respecto a discurso de odio, de promoción de la violencia, o justificación de la violencia. ¿Cómo gestionasteis este tipo de cosas? Y luego me sorprende, es más un comentario que una pregunta, que muchas veces cuando hablas del impacto que ha tenido la Comisión Opsal, te concentras sobre todo en la derivada política y en el acuerdo de paz. Y me parece, siempre me ha dado la sensación, que se trataba de un proceso que tenía un potencial de enriquecimiento y de sanador para la población muy alto. El hecho simplemente de hacerse. Y entonces creo que ese es un valor interesante y que no habías hecho énfasis y me gustaría si podéis hacer algún comentario.
Okay. All right.
Molt bé, doncs.
So everybody in Catalonia having something different to say about the situation. Well, that's very, very similar in Northern Ireland. It's a very politicized society. Everybody has an opinion. A lot of people are very sick of politics, but people feel very strongly. So our job was really to give a platform to many voices, to as many voices as we could. I come to the second point, the other questioner, the second question on that. But so while people have very strong things to say because of the despair and fatalism back in 1992, people had stopped giving their opinions. This thing had gone on for 24 years. The politicians had failed. The paramilitary organizations were still killing people. What's the point in giving your opinion? There was no forum. There was no assembly. There was no parliament. People were very disillusioned and despairing. And what we hoped in a small way was we would hear all those voices, some of them very hard line, some of them pro-violence, some of them very negative. But it's interesting that, to go to the second speech, or to Pablo's second question, or Pablo's question maybe it was, hate speech was not a problem. I don't remember hate speech being a problem. Now maybe in my sifting of the written submissions before the public hearings, I maybe probably sifted out any of those that involved hate speech. I can't remember, but I'm sure I did that. But my memory is there weren't that many. I think the fact, can I just stress one very important thing? And maybe if you're ever thinking of doing something like this in Catalonia, the chair, the chairman or the chair of the commission is such an important position. Torkel Opsal was a brilliant international lawyer, a lovely gentleman, a brilliant listener who had done this sort of thing in all sorts of places. He went on from Northern Ireland to do it in the former Yugoslavia. He investigated war crimes in the former Yugoslavia. He'd done it in Korea, he'd done it in Iran, similar things. He was a wonderful listener. And George Mitchell, Senator George Mitchell, who was the American the Speaker of the House of Representatives in America, who came and oversaw the negotiations that led to the Good Friday Agreement, was another brilliant listener. And if you get a brilliant listener, an eminent man, a gentleman, to listen to a lot of people, something happens. There's some chemistry. And I think this happened. I remember in a small town in the west of Northern Ireland, very divided town, full of many killings. I remember one priest said, very outspoken priest, said, speaking to the Opsahl Commission made him feel like a citizen of classical Athens. He was a citizen speaking. And I think that atmosphere somehow, I'm looking back, so maybe I have rose-tinted spectacles now, I don't know, but that was part of our success, is that people spoke, my memory is, in a civilized way, in a constructive way, and many ideas came out. I have, pages of ideas that came out of that exercise. And we said to people, talk about anything that's important to you. This is your place, your society. You love this place. You fear for this place. You hope for this place. Tell us what your thoughts about it. Tell us your hopes, your fears, your ideas for the future. And it seemed to work. So in that way, in a tiny way, maybe it did, because of its timing and because things started to change around that time on the political and on the side of violence or not violence. Maybe in a small way, we contributed to that by giving people a voice. And then there was a question of, so anyway, the danger of disparaging the feelings of the other. Well, when I go online now, when I go onto social media and I see the hate speech in Northern Ireland now, among young people who never experienced the violence, the troubles, the conflict, it makes me very depressed. But then that's in the world now, online, people anonymously can engage in hate speech. I'm not saying that 27 years ago there wasn't hate speech, but it was more maybe hate feelings. People didn't have the opportunity to turn it into speech. And my experience is that it didn't happen during the hearings of the Opsahl Commission. Okay, there was a question then about not becoming a Republican platform. Again, we found that all sorts of people believed in dialogue and believed, despite in those days, Northern Ireland being seen as one of the most insoluble political conflicts in Europe, perhaps in the world, people felt that the conflict could be managed. I remember Torkel Opsal said in his introduction, he quoted an international lawyer he knew who knew Northern Ireland well. The only people entitled to talk about solutions are chemists. The only people entitled to talk about solutions are chemists. And Torkel, with his huge experience of conflicts all over the world and human rights violations all over the world, says, you can manage. Conflict is normal. Conflict is what we do, is part of everyday life. It's a question of managing conflict so it doesn't become violent. And that was a theme. People actually seemed to think Northern Ireland they understood Northern Ireland was a difficult and divided place, but we could do better. And we did do better. And we are doing better than we were 27 years ago. So there was a pragmatism in the contributions to the Opsahl Commission that was maybe a little bit surprising. And the last thing, the healing potential. Well, in a very small way, I think the exercise was a healing exercise. Nobody had ever done anything like this before in Northern Ireland. Very few people had done anything like this before in Europe. It was a very unusual and almost unprecedented exercise. We looked around to see what other similar exercises had happened up to then, and we found one in Sweden when the Swedish Red Cross organized a an exercise about all sorts of things to do with Swedish society, and there were 22,000 participants. But that was in Sweden, one of the most democratic and peaceful countries in Europe. So we were doing this in a violent, backward, reactionary, small province, small region, and it worked. And maybe I know nothing about the politics of Catalonia. I go and lie on the beach in Pot de la Selva for a fortnight every year, and it's one of the highlights of my year. But I know nothing. I read the newspapers, but I know nothing about the politics of Catalonia. I know that you are divided, very divided, over the independence issue. But maybe, not maybe, certainly, there are all sorts of people in Catalonia who do want to live together, who do want to find mechanisms and structures which can allow them to live together with their very different national and political and cultural ethoses. And I suppose that's what we came up with, some of those ideas in Northern Ireland, and some of those ideas to do things in a very imaginative and complicated way. There was nothing more complicated than the Good Friday Agreement. It was a miracle of complication with its consociationalism, its basis in consociationalism, that's old enemies sharing power together. It was hugely complex. The voting systems, the registration systems, the recognitions of your nationality is very complex. But it has worked. It hasn't brought us reconciliation. That's going to be a long process. But it's brought us peace, relative peace, and we can learn how to do things together. The two parties in government in Northern Ireland in the last 3 months, the Republicans, Sinn Féin, the Unionists, the extreme Unionists, DUP, have worked together. The two women party leaders, the two who lead the region now, have worked together against the coronavirus successfully. So there is hope in deeply divided societies like Northern Ireland. I don't know, maybe like Catalonia. And I think an exercise like ours identify from listening to ordinary people some of those points of hope, some of those pragmatic points of hope.
Punts pragmàtics d'esperança.
Mil gràcies, Andy, per la teva passió explicant la comissió Opsal, que sembla un exercici democràtic fascinant, jo crec, i molt admirable. I moltes gràcies a la resta, crec que ha estat molt interessant i bueno, ja prendrem conclusions respecte de tot el que ens ha explicat l'Andy, que jo crec que és molt i que hem de digerir a poc a poc. Jo crec que per això la idea de gravar la sessió està molt bé i quan tinguem, encara no sé on ha quedat gravat, però quan la recuperi, si algun de vosaltres la vol tenir, l'enviarem perquè jo crec que és per tornar a veure i prendre punts, quasi. Thank you very much, Andy. It's been
Moltes gràcies, Andy. Moltes gràcies. I ara jo no el sento.
Oh, thank you very much. That's all I can say then.
Gràcies, gràcies a tots i totes. Moltes gràcies i bona sort amb la vostra feina. Gràcies.
Mil gràcies, John. John, gràcies.
A vosaltres, a vosaltres.
Gràcies. Vinga, doncs ja ens veurem, no sé ben bé quan, ja veurem quina continuïtat donem a això.
Espera que l'Andy parla, no?
So useful and inspiring. Thank you so much, Andy.
Okay, and if you ever, I'm always in Barcelona. I don't know about this year because of the coronavirus, but for the past 7 years, I've been in Barcelona at the end of August or early September on the way to.
Jo sempre vinc a Catalunya.
Andy, we'll keep in touch. If you come to Barcelona, let me know because we will.
Fantastic, great.
We'll have to do something together.
So keep up the good work.
Or at least take a beer or coffee or maybe.
Be brilliant. It will be brilliant. Okay. God bless you all.
Thank you. Bye.